Uh, let's go back a little bit in time, in history before we actually start, because history needs reiteration. How did you first arrive at this name, Kochi-Muziris Biennale, and who approached you with the idea of having a Biennale in Kerala, in India?
See, as you know, that the Biennale, the idea was proposed in one of the meetings by me to the Culture Minister of Kerala, M.A. Baby. In a meeting we had along with Bose and Mr. Jyoti Basu. So the initial idea was to, look at, the current socio-political scene and come up with a site which will have a kind of a, larger cultural identity, which is very cosmopolitan, multicultural, inclusive in its nature. And so Kochi is like an ideal location to have, something of a contemporary discourse, and Biennale becomes a kind of a, in one way or the other, it becomes an artistic argument in the current Indian context of art. At the same time, it's something which fulfills, to some extent our generation's potential to kind of react to the time which we live in. So that's very key in the context of the Biennale. Like when it's not just an art project, it's we look at it as kind of a cultural intervention in that context. So initially, though it was proposed as Kochi Biennale, later in some of the conversations which we had in Kerala with people like Thomas Isaac, the then finance minister, then Penny Kuriakos, who was heading the Muslims Heritage Project, Venu sir, who was the cultural secretary and also the secretary of education, tourism. So we reached that, making it or linking or taking the name also, because though the Biennale was ideated with a kind of a larger, historical depth, but we thought it would be always good to kind of associate or adopt this mythical name, which has got a strong historical relevance. So that's how we reached that. But after 2-3 months, we decided to kind of call it Kochi-Muziris Biennale. So
That should have been early 2012. Or
2010.
Yes, as any artistic endeavor is wont to, it is fraught. It operates at multiple levels. Yet in this site, in the Kochi-Muziris Biennale site, on the face of it doesn't look like one of contestation, one of contest in this world actually. However, despite the seeming seamlessness of the entire project or the exhibition, how to your mind do artists raise uncomfortable questions?
Uncomfortable question which we are all facing, whether it's an artist or it's a layman or anybody in this world right now, is how do we counter the conflicts which we have. See, so the proposal actually the Biennale put forward in the form of an exhibition by the participation of like selected artists who already had a position in the art world, at the same time had a potential to adopt to a theme like this, was to celebrate the idea of cosmopolitanism, which is very much of Kochi and also of Muziris. See, once you do that, it brings back a great notion or an understanding about one's own history back into a contemporary consciousness. You see, the Biennale has actually done that. It has brought back a strong historical memory to some extent, if you put it like that, and how history can be built, or how history can be looked at as a future project. So it's actually the future of history, like which we have, is something which has been very much there from the inception of the pioneer. How do you respond to a site? How do you respond to a community? How do you accommodate a larger issue of even infrastructure to some extent? How do you argue for an autonomy of an artist? And how do you look at the premise of the art world? How, so far, even in Indian context, I mean, how much we are still following kind of Euro-American tendencies in our own, conventional way of looking at art. And in one way, if you really look at the contemporary art practices which is emerging from our country, a country which is like very, multicultural in its own nature, has been producing works worth archiving. So there should be a system in place. First of all, one, to encourage it, to kind of have stronger political arguments, stronger social concerns in the work. I think this Biennale's the basic aim is also that. I mean, it's just to encourage such kind of liberal spaces where it can be kind of a site for such arguments. So that is happening at one way, and the second stage is, I would say, a discourse. So the Biennale has also, to some extent, have initiated a discourse around what is produced. Because if you really look at last year's biennial, 73% of the work was site produced. And what do you mean by site produced? It's actually creating something new to the premise of contemporary art, which never existed before. An artist like Vivan Sundaram taking his time and energy to kind of investigate or research into what is the so-called glory of Muziris. How does it associate it with certain natural formations itself? So he kind of excavated that history and brought it into light through an interesting narrative, which is an artist tool. So things were possible, even much before than even 2012. But we never took an initiative to do that, because that was the nature of artist practice. So artists were not, since several years, I mean, there have been great moments in Indian art where artists have taken social responsibility to kind of to become part of the nation building, part of being a movement, part of being, social reforms and other things. But in recent years, artists have not come together like the way they came together when they got an opportunity. So the Biennale has become an opportunity also for everybody to come together and show their solidarity to take India ahead. I mean, that I would look at it like that, because if you see this country at this stage, if you look at the last 1 year itself, the way the social premise was changing, so we were almost like getting hijacked by a sense of fear, and there was a kind of a heady mix of belief that power is something which is like which is some way or the other taken, not just given. And it became part of our sensories, and if you consider what happened in last few days in the same center of power, that people change the destiny of how the power has to be handled. So I think there is some hope which you're also feeling in a system that people are very powerful, so the strength of democracy is being again seen, and so immediately with one incident you see how the Indian consciousness changed. So any action, which is a social action, if you say, which has got great amount of ripple effect. So in that context, if you take even the biennial, as a movement or an event, it had its own cerebral impact, among people. That it is making people think about what one should be doing. It is telling them possibilities to kind of go back to don't just be around the rationale, be a little bit more open about understanding even art and languages and creative potentials. So I think it has to some way it has opened up, because in India being, I think I mentioned to you earlier, so when there is, we thought there is a cerebral damage happening to our society, there was the people immediately kind of corrected in the twist of a time. So we are a country now, we can believe that cerebral damage has not happened to our nation, because, and then you come down to a place like Kerala, which is almost like a feat of the nation. So, and our responsibility is very much one way or the other is very explicit. It's cultural, it's more political, because see, this Biennale also takes a lot of energy from the history of social action of Kerala, and also the political engagement. So if you do that acupuncture in a place which almost like the feet of the nation, where you have, maybe kind of better combination, which will be a kind of a, bloodstream which reaches the head. So there is, you can see actually a possibility of two things happening parallelly. There is a movement, which is kind of unifying the people, and the people who are literally speaking like, the migrants. That they are not the people who are stationed. So when you are not stationed, you also don't have the aspirations which are capturing aspiration you will never have. You will always have a kind of little bit more of a humanistic approach to life. You will never try to kind of play with your power, because you are part of shared space. That is what Delhi has proved. So when you come down to Kerala also, Kerala's Biennale's agenda is also about that. You are living in a shared space since last 3,000 years. So you are, a cultivated being, or much more, refined being, because you are part of a culture of migration. That the movement. When you move, the ideas move. So I think in putting all these things together, I'm seeing there is something positive happening, in terms of art and culture, in terms of political movements, because we were placed in contrast, so some corrections happening. It's very interesting to see that in that context.
Just to quickly take on from here, how do we communicate this idea that the Biennale does not stand in isolation, does not stand in splendid isolation, and that the Biennale actually is a site speaking to power, as it were. How do we communicate this idea?
See, the problem is also, the problem has been there since several years in the context of art, because art is something which has been looked at by people as an elitist exercise. That is one. And second, if you really take, to kind of understand how society has been responding to kind of sources of information, sources of aesthetical pleasure, source of reading. So it always something which traveled with technology, and it kind of most of those kind of art forms had an ability to kind of multiply without losing the content, because of the technology was like that. But art is something which is also a kind of a very unique proposition. So you need to kind of cultivate another interest for people to kind of go and see it or come and see it. See, it is a challenge, to kind of, because we are actually dealing with exclusivity. That exclusivity is not elitism. You have to tell the people exclusivity is not elitism. Exclusivity is like something which is special. You have to make them understand that special nature of something which is created has to be communicated to people in its own available or like meaningful languages. And because we live in a society that where everybody argues that I should understand everything, it's because that's the rationale everybody applies to. If I don't understand, I will not approach it. So that clarity was exercised in a society like this. But then you're bringing back art, which is traditionally been part of our blood, where we never understood everything but we enjoyed. But we went through a phase that the rational thinking was like very high. Now we are actually this project is taking us back into a time where everything is also like in Maya. So it's it has everything might not be understood. Everything has got different meanings. So you might get one meaning one day and next day the same thing will give you another meaning. So this has to be taught or made understood to people, so they will understand it's not about elitism, it is about a special knowledge and understanding. Once that happens, which happened to some extent, I feel with the last edition itself, it has happened to some extent with people that it is a public space. We can walk in, we can walk in and experience an art which is not elitist, which is much more intellectual, much more disciplined, much more argumentative, much more political. See, once you send that message to people that it is about them, it is about their own existence and time, then they start accommodating it, because it becomes works as a kind of new knowledge system. So that knowledge system has to sustain for several years to transform the people who were actually succumbed to kind of a rationale. So I think that you have to kind of take them beyond. So that is the work of the biennial to some extent. How do you make people understand that this is part of their life? That's also one reason, like when we are using a slogan that art is life itself. So it has to be communicated. Because you are operating in a site that where you don't have any institutional understanding, that where our kids learn art as part of their life. They might learn mathematics and science and other idioms which they feel that that's what is going to give them job. We don't teach, the music is not compulsory, art is not compulsory, and cinema is not compulsory. Nothing is compulsory which we use the most.
Ironically.
Yeah, ironically. So that we have to unless and until you change that system, art will always struggle because it will always look like exclusive.
Yes.
So you have to break that notion of exclusivity. Why certain things work in a society? Because they break exclusivity. And historically artists have done it. You see, we all celebrate Raja Ravi Verma, of somebody who has followed Indian myth, at the same time followed English way of making paintings. He followed both, but he came up with imageries which has become kind of a decor of everybody's house. But if you take one metaphor from what Ravi Verma produced, take for example Saraswati. So he used technology, the advanced technology which was available at that time, to send that image to everybody's house by replicating it. So he was not just a painter, he was also somebody who was one of the most interesting Democrat as an artist, and he made that Saraswati image possible as a metaphor for the society to kind of also to follow. You have to kind of have that presence of Saraswati. But in the current context, if you really look at what art is doing, or what even a biennial is doing, it is also another form of Saraswati. But here the issue is that you have to come and see it. So that message is there. Now you have to come and see this, but because we don't replicate, the replication is only happening in the form of information or technology, those devices. So there is a knowledge bank which can be considered as a Saraswati for you to kind of understand the time which you live in. So see, the artists have a different ways of operating, but do you read it like that? So maybe you have to start treating it like that.